Jay Wood from Wheaton College is going to be presenting his paper, Humility's Intellectual Rewards. Jay has been on faculty at Wheaton since 1982 and has been noted for his work in virtue epistemology, collaborative work, very fruitful collaboration with Bob Roberts, particularly on his work with Oxford University Press, Intellectual Virtues, an essay in regulative epistemology. But more recently, Jay has also published essays on the intellectual virtues that go into Christian intellectual inquiry. And I know he'll be drawing upon some of that work in what he's presenting to us this afternoon. So thank you, Jay, for being with us. I'll hand it over to you.
This paper is, as Steve mentioned, Humility's Intellectual Rewards. And I'm going to be so humble about this as to defer to all of you. So anybody who has objections they'd like to make to this paper at the end, I'll simply concede, and then we'll get out of here a little bit sooner. Back to the cookies. Philosophers known as virtue epistemologists claim that intellectual goods, such as knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, are more easily obtained by persons possessing mature traits of moral and intellectual character, such as prudence, open-mindedness, teachability, than by persons who lack these virtues or who are marked by their opposing vices. In this paper, I focus on the virtue of humility and ask whether humble persons are better situated than their proud opposites to obtain various intellectual goods. In the first half of this paper, I set out and defend a general account of humility, differentiating it from what I consider to be some mistaken accounts. In the second half, I will show some of the ways humility, as I understand it, helps to increase our share of intellectual goods. Here I focus on intellectual humility, so called because it is humility as it influences the way we use our intellectual powers in our intellectual endeavors as we pursue intellectual goods. As we will see, intellectual humility leads indirectly to intellectual gains. It does not, I think, supercharge our cognitive powers so much as it changes intellectual agents themselves in ways that allow them to resist pride and to direct their intellectual abilities and practices with increased effectiveness. So, part one, what is humility? Well, humility is a deeply anchored disposition that frees persons from pride or inordinate self-love in its many forms. Self-ambition, selfish ambition, snobbishness, vanity, conceit, arrogance, and domination, to name just a few. Humble persons are largely untroubled by the burden of self-glorification. They are liberated from constant worry over where they stand in some pecking order, or by the fact that someone else may be surpassing them in some theater of competition. Humble persons pay little, if any, heed to how many Facebook friends they have accumulated or how their most recent posts are trending. Humble academicians are not anxious about their level of popularity, nor do they fret if a colleague's book should eclipse their own on the Amazon sales ranking. Both humble and proud scholars bear the burden of mastering intellectual content, but the proud bear an additional burden, the burden of self-promotion, of making sure their accomplishments are acknowledged and praised. Humble scholars may naturally feel gratified when they advance their own or others' understanding, but their delight derives chiefly from the joy of discovery and deepened understanding, not from its potential to win recognition and applause. The burden of self-promotion is shrugged off for something more important. Humble persons are most often freed from the tyranny of pride because excessive self-regard is supplanted by a more virtuous concern for intellectual, moral, religious, and social goods, such as deepened understanding, doing one's work well, and loving God and neighbor. Humble academicians typically have their sights set on genuine and lasting goods, such as gaining and imparting knowledge, rather than the ephemeral goods of status and attention. When Barbara McClintock received the Nobel Prize for her work with so-called jumping genes, she remarked on how unfair it seemed, and here I quote, to reward a person for having so much pleasure over the years asking the maize plant to solve specific problems and then watching its responses. End of quote. Evelyn Keller, McClintock's biographer, notes how eagerly McClintock conveyed her sheer joy in her work. And again I quote, "As you look at these things, they become part of you, and you forget yourself. The main thing about it is that you forget yourself." End of quote. End of McClintock. Her remarks made it plain that her joy derived from the wonders of the genes themselves, from deepened understanding, and not from the acclaim she garnered for having discovered some of their secrets. McClintock's remarks reveal a characteristic pattern or deep structure that typifies the attitudes and actions of even highly accomplished but humble persons. They deflect attention away from themselves onto something more important, as did John the Baptist with his famous, he must increase and I must decrease. Consider the somewhat stylized gestures of an orchestral conductor after a particularly rapturous performance. While the conductor bows, appropriately acknowledging his or her contribution, the greater part of the post-performance ceremony sees the conductor shaking the hand of the concertmaster, embracing the soloists, bidding the orchestra to stand for special recognition, and making sweeping gestures directed upward as if to thank Beethoven or Bach as the ones most deserving of praise. A humble conductor would not disclaim her role in the performance, but would have been equally joyous and filled with admiration had the performance been led by another conductor. Interestingly, I came across another little anecdote about Stephen Colbert talking about improv. And in his discussions about improv, he says, there is no star in improv. Everybody is responsible to the other person. And then he said this about his own show. He says, "I have my own show, which is very full of talented people ready to serve me. But at my best, I am serving them just as hard. And together, we serve a common idea, and a sure sign that things are going well is when no one can really remember whose idea was whose, or who should get the credit for what jokes." So it's kind of interesting. They were in it for something more than the recognition, but putting on a good show. Humility also works to detect and check stirrings of pride where the temptation to it still remains. An element of self-control is present in humility, as it is in some other virtues. The courageous person is not free from fear, but rather successfully recognizes and manages her fears. A forbearing person may feel vexed by another's behavior, but resists the temptation to scold or suppress the offender, the quote-unquote offender. So too, I suggest, humble persons are sensitive to and able to tamp down the stirrings of inordinate self-love, thus enabling them to reorient their vision away from the status of self to more important goods. Persons possessing humility in its most mature form, however, have less and less need to overcome contrary inclinations. Their default mode of being is one untroubled by a preoccupation with attention, status, rank, and the like. Philosophers differ over the concept of humility, as they do over most virtue terms. Setting aside those, such as Aristotle and Nietzsche, who think it a vice, three errors concerning humility crop up regularly. Some thinkers wrongly describe humility as a disposition to think of oneself more lowly or less accomplished than is the case. Call this the deflationary account of humility. On this account, A humble concertmaster, say, of an orchestra, would act humbly by falsely supposing that she is not actually the best violinist in the orchestra, and therefore undeserving of her post. By requiring that we judge ourselves less accomplished, less intelligent, less capable than we really are, this account of humility requires us to believe what is false, strictly speaking. Ironically, the deflationary account makes humility not so much a moral virtue as an intellectual vice, since it disposes persons to view themselves in a false light. Kind of a humorous example. C.S. Lewis has his senior tempter, Screwtape, offer this advice for corrupting a person en route to true humility. And here I quote, "Fix in his mind the idea that humility consists in trying to believe his talents to be less valuable than he believes them to be. No doubt they are, in fact, less than he believes, but that is beside the point. The great thing is to make him value an opinion for some quality other than truth, thus introducing an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise threatens to become a virtue." End of quote. The deflationary account also undermines even weak versions of the unity or the reciprocity of the virtues. Prudence, for example, requires that we deliberate and judge well in order to live and act well. Insofar as humility requires that we deflate the truth about our true merits, it might easily lead to imprudence, or as G.K. Chesterton sarcastically quips, to producing a race of men too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication tables. Would we willingly undergo the knife of a surgeon overcome with humility in the deflationary sense? No, I'm not really good enough to perform this operation. Humility, as the saying goes, is not about thinking less of oneself, but about thinking of oneself less. Perhaps the most widely voiced but errant account of humility describes it as the capacity to conduct a frank and sober assessment of one's true strengths and weaknesses. According to this humility as honesty view, humble persons have a disposition to conduct accurate internal audits, resulting in truthful beliefs about their merits and demerits, their good points and their bad points. Norvin Richards, for example, views humility as an inclination to, and here I quote, "be realistic about your abilities and your limitations, rather than thinking yourself abler than you are." End of quote. Now, this view is better than the deflationary view because it leads one toward, rather than away from, the truth about oneself. This is not humility, however, but honesty or truthfulness, which are no doubt aided by humility's power to suppress forms of pride that obstruct honest self-appraisal. Humility, however, cannot be equivalent to honest self-assessment, since someone can be painfully and truthfully aware that he is inferior to another in some arena of competition, but be incited thereby to new, unhumble heights of envy and competitiveness. The humility as honesty account backfires by frequently fostering the very kind of self-preoccupation that true humility is supposed to combat. If humility consists in one's rightly appraising her strengths and weaknesses, then, like the hypochondriac who is constantly taking her temperature, the self-appraiser's gaze is directed inward upon the self, thereby obscuring greater goods to which one's focus might otherwise have been directed. For Christians, says Dietrich von Hildebrand, and I quote, "Humility is closely connected with the holy freedom in which we acquire the proper perspective in relation to our own person, regarding our persons no longer with our own eyes, but in the light of God. The humble man no longer presumes to determine where he stands. He leaves it to God." End of quote. Self-assessments require a rubric, a metric, And for the Christians, the appropriate scale is nothing short of perfect holiness before a perfect God, a scale that will always find us simul justus et peccator, always in need of grace. This makes any personal inventory we conduct a way of orienting our lives toward God, not a means of comparing ourselves with others. For Christians, the gaze turned inward is simultaneously a gaze turned upward, where there is no room for pride or invidious comparisons. The humility as honesty view confuses the nature of humility with one of its customary effects, namely introspective honesty. Vicious pride, humility's opposite, causes epistemic blindness. Conceited persons exaggerate their merits and are therefore unable to judge accurately the true extent of their praiseworthy traits or accomplishments. Vain persons are unduly captive to the assessments others make about them, leading them to adjust self-assessments up or down as it contributes to improved social standing. Arrogant persons falsely believe themselves entitled to goods and free from burdens the rest of us bear because of their alleged superiority. The arrogant person's specious sense of superiority bars him from seeing the truth about what he is and is not entitled to in life. Generally speaking, grandiosity, narcissism, egoism, and other species of pride cause epistemic blindness that undermines our capacity for accurate self-audits. Humility opposes pride in all its forms, and insofar as one is free of excessive self-regard, one is less susceptible to epistemic blindness, and therefore more likely to conduct sober and honest self-appraisals. Humility is not conceptually identical to honesty, but insofar as it opposes pride and counters epistemic blindness, it paves the way for accurate self-assessment. So it is correct to say that humility and honest self-assessment are bedfellows, so to speak. We can easily imagine conceited persons so in love with themselves and their own opinions that they think their views on most subjects better grounded and more resistant to criticism than they truly are. Dogmatism, close-mindedness, unteachability, and a hardening of the intellectual categories often results. This leads to a third error about humility, especially as it concerns the intellectual life, namely, that it should be equated with holding a belief with exactly that degree of firmness the belief merits, where firmness is proportional to the reliability of the faculties and processes that produced it. So, intellectually humble persons would hold a memorial belief about very early childhood less firmly than a memorial belief about what occurred yesterday. This description does not describe humility, but another virtue, intellectual firmness, the disposition to hold one's belief with a circumstantially appropriate level of confidence, neither too firmly nor too lightly. Humility as appropriate firmness, again, confuses intellectual humility with one of its fruits. Proud persons tend to have an exaggerated estimation of their cognitive powers, the acuity of their judgments, and hence of the level of support their beliefs enjoy. Intellectual humility, while not identical to proper firmness, nevertheless enables it by checking forms of pride that lead to holding our beliefs with inappropriately high levels of confidence. Cases of inappropriate firmness, where pride and humility play no part, further show that humility should not be equated with holding our beliefs with the appropriate degree of firmness. Imagine someone saying, "I've always believed P," insert some political, religious, moral, or philosophical view, "and I'm not about to change my mind at this stage of my life." Here we have a person who is calcified intellectually, whose firmness of belief stems not from an assessment of its having been reliably produced, nor from pride, but rather is born out of laziness, out of a desire to avoid the difficulty of rethinking some issue. Conscientiousness, not humility, is the appropriate antidote for such a person. We notionally acknowledge that humility is a virtue, and we admire it from afar when we see it in others. But we fear the process we must go through to acquire it for ourselves. We often have that attitude toward humility that the young Augustine had toward chastity. Lord, he prayed, give me chastity, but not yet. This fear is often rooted in the mistaken belief that humility requires that we undergo humiliation, that we be abased, belittled, embarrassed before others, made the object of ridicule, and the like. Imagine a teacher about to hand back the course's major research paper and pausing to comment to the whole class, "Never in my entire teaching career have I seen a more pathetic, pitiable intellectual effort than that produced by Mr. Wood. Its failings are so manifold and severe that I can only attribute them to colossal stupidity or the malicious desire to give me the worst reading experience of my life." If humiliation, even in its milder forms, is an essential step in acquiring the virtue of humility, it's no wonder that we don't earnestly seek it. You'll be happy to know that humiliation does not prompt people to think of themselves less. Humiliation, however, does not prompt people to think of themselves less. Usually the opposite. Humiliation frequently fosters anger and shame, and in their wake, a concern to regain status, often by means as or more morally inappropriate than the humiliation itself. If I may be permitted a most humble illustration, think here of Buddy, Mr. Incredible's biggest fan, who Mr. Incredible coldly and repeatedly rebuffs as a possible partner. This dismissive treatment hardens Buddy's resolve to regain face and win the world's attention as the syndrome, the supreme superhero. Humiliation provoked not humility, but its opposite, an intense preoccupation with status that in Syndrome's case took a diabolical path. To derive amusement and satisfaction from someone's having lost face or been made the butt of a joke or in some other way ridiculed or mocked is a form of schadenfreude, the vicious act of delighting in the misfortune of another. Such vicious delight is not only contrary to charity, it is also unjust, as it fails to respect the other's dignity, which is his due. If failure to respect the dignity of the other were a pathway to virtuous humility, then vice would be a means to virtue, and morality a house divided against itself. Again, even a modest commitment to the unity of the virtues cannot permit this. Spinoza observes in his Ethics that, and I quote, those who are believed to be most despondent and humble are usually the most ambitious and envious. End of quote. Nowhere, perhaps, do we see this more clearly illustrated than in the humble, unctuous character of Uriah Heep from Dickens' great novel, David Copperfield. And here I quote the humble Uriah. I wish I could do this in a Cockney accent, but I can't. But how little you think of the rightful humbleness of a person in my station, Master Copperfield. Father and me was both brought up at a foundation school for boys. They taught us all a deal of humbleness. Not much else that I know of, from morning to night. We was to be humble to this person and humble to that, and to pull off our caps here and to make our bows there, and always to know our place and to base ourselves before our betters. Oh, I ate humble pie with an appetite. End of quote. The foundation school's approach to virtue education has little to commend it. It fails to recognize that humility is consistent with an appropriate level of self-regard. To suppose persons can be browbeaten into true humility makes no more sense than to think that forcing someone to give away a prized position fosters true generosity. As Dickens' story makes plain, we do not acquire humility through self-abasement or other forms of self-contempt. Uriah's self-abasement only increased his preoccupation with his status, or the lack thereof, and fueled his efforts to gain recognition and power over others. A perfect illustration, I think, of Nietzschean resentment, rightly dismissed by David Copperfield as the detestable cant of false humility. Well, how then do we acquire and grow in humility, if not through humiliation? Aristotle taught, of course, that virtues are acquired by imitating the various virtuous exemplars among us. The brave masters fears, the generous give good gifts in the right way, and the just render to others their due. But what do the humble do such that we can imitate it? This question is especially relevant since humility, as I define it, is marked more by what it doesn't do than what it does. Freedom from inordinate self-concern doesn't necessarily come accompanied by any external markers or obvious observable behavior. Yet we do recognize humble actions when we see them because they conform to the pattern of being unconcerned about honor and deference in order to focus on more important matters. Consider the paradigmatic example of humility, Jesus of Nazareth, who, although identical to God, forsook the glory and honor to which he was supremely entitled to endure the temptations and travails of a human life and to suffer an unjust and painful death for our sake. True to the pattern of humility, his self-lowering was so that we might be directed to a great good, restored friendship with God. Jesus' humble character, however, was outwardly and deliberately displayed in the things he did and said, in order that his disciples would imitate his example. At the Passover feast, the Gospel of Luke tells us that the status-conscious disciples disputed amongst themselves as to who was to be the greatest. Jesus answered their concern about status by humbly washing their feet. Jesus asks, and here I quote, "Do you understand what I have just done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." No, I mean, he doesn't have any false understanding about who he is and the respect and the honor to which he's entitled. "If I then wash your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." End of quote. Jesus is perfectly aware of his status as rabbi and Lord, but he deliberately sets aside the honor and deference he is due in order to teach his disciples a deep truth about genuine leadership. Humility is displayed immediately and spontaneously in the morally mature. For the rest of us, acquiring humility often requires that we act deliberately in ways that require us to deflect considerations of status. The Rule of St. Benedict offers maybe the first 12-step program for the difficult work of deepening humility, which begins by taking seriously Christ's words that everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. While difficult in the beginning, deliberate acts of humility culminate, says Benedict, in a mature humility that appears simple and natural. That's quote, appears simple and natural, arising out of, and again I quote, "good habits and with a pleasure derived of the virtue." End of quote. Imagine a corporate boss wandering into the coffee lounge and setting about to tidy it up and make fresh coffee for everyone. Imagine a famous scholar insisting that his research assistant be named first author on some article and that his own name appear last, even though each contributed equally. Consider the actual story of Nick Wallenda, the world's most watched high-wire artist. Over 1 billion people viewed his first ever walks across Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon. Wallenda, who is a Christian, realizes that his successful stunts could very easily give way to pride. So he adopts the following discipline after every feat. He spends hours on his hands and knees cleaning up the trash left behind by the spectators. And here I quote from Wallenda. "My purpose is simply to help clean up after myself. The huge crowd left a great deal of trash behind, and I feel compelled to pitch in. Besides, after the inordinate amount of attention I sought and received, I need to keep myself grounded. Humility does not come naturally to me, so I have to force myself into situations that are humbling. So be it. If I have to force myself into situations that are humbling, so be it. As a follower of Jesus, I see him washing the feet of others. I do it because if I don't serve others, I'll be serving nothing but my own ego." End of quote. In sum, then, we learn humility by imitating the clear examples of the humble among us, by acting purposefully to set aside concerns for status for the sake of some other good. As we have noted, humility sometimes requires that we tamp down pride. The ordinary course of life typically provides occasions in which we are brought up short, in which we see that our preferred ways of thinking and acting prove to be inadequate. Such experiences can have an ego-deflating and corrective effect. Reflecting on past instances in which we have been corrected helps to check pride, acting as ballast to the ego, which like a balloon filled with hot air threatens to rise with an exaggerated sense of its own importance. A variety of more direct strategies also help us to avoid occasions for self-exaltation, choosing to listen rather than being first to speak, being receptive to well-meant criticisms of one's work, yielding to a colleague's plans and preferences rather than insisting on our own way, etc. These and other strategies for deflecting attention and other ego-expanding opportunities are some of the ways we wean ourselves from pride's grip and become humble persons. Is there a clock in here perchance? I don't have a watch with me. Okay, and we go till? Okay, thank you. Pride, part 2, pride and humility in the intellectual life. In this section, I explore how humility aids our intellectual endeavors by noting some species of pride and how humility opposes these instances of pride to aid our pursuit of intellectual goods. Snobbishness and chauvinism in the intellectual realm share a disposition to excessive belief in the superiority of one's beliefs and practices while simultaneously looking down one's nose or deprecating those who do not share one's beliefs and intellectual practices. Academics display the intellectual variant of this vice when they unduly suppose their own school of thought, their own way of thinking and doing, so superior to the alternatives that they unjustifiably dismiss other points of view, methodologies, or practices. We might imagine an analytic philosopher disparaging Continental philosophy, or a snobbish Freudian looking down upon the therapeutic techniques of behaviorist or humanistic psychologists. In doing so, however, both risk losing out on insights that might supplement or even correct their own practice. One of intellectual chauvinism's more extreme forms leads to scientism, the view that only the empirical, experimental methods of the physical sciences yield true knowledge, leaving all other academic disciplines to traffic merely in opinion. So construed, this form of intellectual pride fosters close-mindedness that risks cutting us off from persons and ideas that potentially contribute to our growth in intellectual goods. It constitutes a sort of imperialism, and here the chauvinism-imperialism distinction is one which you will all recognize as coming from William Alston. It constitutes a sort of imperialism whereby all intellectual fields are judged by the prevailing standard of one field. Surely it is wrong to suppose that the kind of certainty and checking procedures available to mathematicians can be demanded of ordinary perceptual statements, and vice versa. Conceit is a form of pride that moves people to form an unwarranted high opinion of their merits and excellences. It is easy to imagine that a conceited scientist, suffering from an exaggerated sense of his own brilliance, would resist criticism more readily than a scientist whose humility protected him from this form of pride. Paradigmatically, all scientific results must be reproducible, and the system of checks and balances constitutive of good scientific practice frequently corrects earlier results. Articles must be refereed, data assessed for accuracy, and experimental results reproduced. So it is integral to science as a self-correcting discipline to receive criticism and to be prepared to admit that some particular theory or practice is incomplete or incorrect. Conceit interferes with this essential feature of scientific practice. Suitably humble scientists have a rational character that makes them alive to the possibility that their expectations about how nature should behave may be wrong. Philosopher of science Israel Scheffler dubs this openness to correction, quote, a capacity for surprise, end of quote, to which intellectual humility surely contributes, if not, it may be identical actually in the way he uses it. Here I quote from Scheffler, receptive to surprise, we are capable of learning from experience, capable, that is, of acknowledging the inadequacies of our initial beliefs and recognizing their need for improvement. It is thus that the testing of theories, no less than their generation, that calls upon appropriate emotional dispositions. End of quote. Two of 20th century's most famous theoretical physicists offer a contrasting receptivity to surprise. Ronald Clark, Einstein's outstanding biographer, writes that Einstein stubbornly refused, and this is his words, he stubbornly refused to accept indeterminacy in the universe, which allowed statistical chance into the universe, a view Einstein famously dubbed a case of God playing dice with the universe. Clark writes, Einstein refused to be convinced, and as a result ended his career cut off from the newest developments in his field. Nobel laureate Subramanian Chandrasekhar was once asked how he was able to do innovative work in physics well past the age at which most physicists reach their peak. He was 71 when this quote was offered, by the way. His response is a revealing contrast to Einstein. For lack of a better word, and here I'm quoting Chandrasekhar, for lack of a better word, there seems to be a certain arrogance toward nature which people develop. These people have had great insights and made profound discoveries. They imagine afterwards that the fact that they succeeded so triumphantly in one area means they have a special way of looking at science, which must therefore be right. But science doesn't permit that. Nature has shown over and over again that the kinds of truth which underlie nature transcend the most powerful minds. End of quote. Nature has a way of dispelling the great conceit that all her ways can be captured within the frame of a single scientist's perspective. Humility makes scientists more receptive to this lesson. Scientists and other academicians are not born, but made, usually after a prolonged period of apprenticeship and mentoring under senior scholars who impart crucial knowledge and technical proficiency. Practicing scientists are beneficiaries of a deposit of knowledge they did not earn, but inherited. This fact and a modicum of humility should work against hyperautonomy, a species of pride that disinclines us from acknowledging dependence on others and from accepting help from them. Humility corrects any illusions scientists may harbor that they are self-made intellectuals. Humility thus combats unteachableness, a companion of hyperautonomy, making us more open to instruction. On the flip side, it combats egotism, that might move senior researchers to be unduly attentive to their own interests, ignoring the work of training the very apprentices who may be crucial members of a research team. Again, the example of Barbara McClintock is instructive. As we've already seen, McClintock did not seek awards for her research, and when they came, she sought to direct the spotlight away from herself and to the subject of her research. Someone more keen on accolades would not give over a plum research project to a young graduate student research assistant as she did to Harriet Creighton. Unlike academic stars who sometimes use their graduate students as research slaves to advance their own prestige, McClintock gave Harriet Creighton her best research project. McClintock's humility, her lack of attachment to recognition, motivated her to share generously the acclaim her work with Creighton eventually won. Intellectually virtuous scientists are concerned to impart knowledge as well as to acquire it, finding joy in the fact that others delight in newfound knowledge. Humility frequently paves the way for such acts of intellectual generosity. May I borrow your watch? Okay. Most scientific research today is done in teams. The days of lone scientists working alone in their labs have passed. It is not uncommon that a scientific paper has 20 or more authors, each of whom contributed a vital piece toward the paper's conclusion. Team research requires cooperation and a willingness perhaps to subordinate one's preferred methods or investigative techniques for the sake of the group. Arrogance is a species of pride that leads persons to suppose falsely that their allegedly superior status entitles them to enjoy privileges not enjoyed by all, or to escape burdens that befall others. Picture here a movie star who thinks his stardom entitles him to burst into a restaurant, demanding to be seated ahead of others who have been waiting for over an hour to be seated. Arrogant persons commonly think themselves entitled to correct others without being corrected, to load work onto others without bearing their share of the load, to have others yield to their preferences without having to reciprocate. Who would not prefer a humble rather than arrogant partner on a research team? Two of the world's most powerful companies, Google and Microsoft, routinely hire the best scientific and creative minds. But in addition to talent, they have come to appreciate the importance of humility for advancing research. Laszlo Bock, the executive vice president for personnel at Google, recently listed the 5 traits Google most desires among its leadership, one of which is humility. Humility requires that leaders contribute to solving some problems, but then be willing to embrace the better ideas of others. Bock cites intellectual humility as especially important. And I quote, "Without humility, you are unable to learn. Successful, bright people rarely experience failure, and so they don't know how to learn from that failure," said Bock. He continues, "The most successful leaders are those who fiercely defend their position, but are nevertheless willing to yield to another's ideas and say, 'Here's a new fact. That changes everything. You're right.'" End of quote. Satya Nadella, a 46-year-old Indian immigrant, was recently chosen to be the new CEO of Microsoft. And here I quote from an article by Don Clark. "People who have worked with Mr. Nadella say his greatest asset is an affable, collaborative style that stands out at a company known for big egos and heated arguments." End of quote. A former head of Microsoft's India operations notes that you have to be hard driving to rise to the position of CEO. Yet, and here's the quote, "He's humble, incredibly humble." End of quote. Humility's willingness to decrease while someone else increases finds expression in the world of research and development in a collaborative spirit and the disposition to defer to the better idea of a colleague. Well, let me just skip over a couple more illustrations here and just come and consider one conclusion that I think is very much worth considering. But here I consider an objection to my thesis that intellectual humility can advance the fortunes of science more effectively than pride. Can't pride be just as strong a motivator as humility? Might not vanity for professional recognition and rewards drive scientific research as effectively as humility? Some examples show that knowledge can be sought for the sake of its ego-expanding potential. In his book, The Double Helix, a personal account of the structure of DNA, James Watson candidly admits that he and Francis Crick were motivated by more than a desire for scientific knowledge. They sought sole place in the history books for having discovered DNA's structure and the acclaim that would accompany it. They were inordinately driven by the desire for fame, prestige, and such extrinsic goods to knowledge as the Nobel Prize. They dreaded that Linus Pauling might make the discovery first, and were not above making use of Rosalind Franklin's crystallographic photographs of DNA without her permission in order to advance their own work. Watson and Crick would appear to offer a counterexample to my claim that humble scientists are better situated to reap a rich harvest of intellectual goods. Yet, by the way, this race for the DNA was, it was a matter of days, maybe hours here. Maurice Wilkins and Linus Pauling, there were just close competitors, and it was neck and neck. So anyway, yet Watson and Crick's preoccupation with the claim wasn't essential to their discovery. Their intelligence, scientific expertise, and native interest in the problem could have served as sufficient motivation. Indeed, Watson and Crick's closest competitors in the race to discover the structure of DNA serve as noteworthy exceptions to the idea that ego and self-aggrandizement must motivate good science. When Linus Pauling heard about their discovery, Watson reports, and this was Watson himself says, his reaction was one of thrill, suggesting that his joy was in the knowledge discovered, not the prizes associated with its discovery. Rosalind Franklin's biographer, Anne Sayer, writes, her ambitions were never for status or power, end of quote. Fame appears to have played little or no part in motivating Watson and Crick's closest competitors. More strongly, we should note that Watson and Crick's work was parasitic upon the work of humble scientists such as Rosalind Franklin. They might not have won the race to discover the structure of DNA without her work. Ironically, their recognition that they needed the insights of others may constitute the first glimmer of humility on their part. And it is also true that early in their careers, Watson and Crick benefited from others in the scientific community who set aside their own projects to initiate them into the world of scientific research. So, while Watson and Crick were not humble, their discovery benefited indirectly from persons with intellectual humility. A world in which scientists sought knowledge mainly for fame would be far less generous, cooperative, and nurturing of younger scientists than is the case.